Jen, and I grew up in the southern United States, between Louisiana and North Carolina, and I started to read and study anarchism about the time that I was 16. So for about 14 years, I've described myself as an anarchist. I left North Carolina and did a lot of traveling in my late teens and early 20s, and I settled in Texas for a while in Austin, and I worked there for a while, and then I've been up here in Washington going to school for the last couple of years. I started getting involved in anarchism when I was 16, and I sort of discovered it through the library. Basically, I've always loved to read and read a lot all through my childhood, and a series of life experiences basically kind of made me very, very aware of injustice, and I was angry and was kind of like looking for an outlet for that anger, and I got involved in some sort of just kind of like generally left activism, and then when I was at the library, I was searching around and I found Emma Goldman's autobiography, which is kind of impressive that it was in a North Carolina library, honestly. But and after reading that, I became really interested in anarchism, and I kind of found books where I could, and then when if I leave town, I could try and find bookstores that would actually carry books on anarchism, and I just kept reading, and I was really drawn to the ideas kind of centering around a rejection of like hierarchy and oppression, and embracing a more like communist approach to things, like basically how it involved, it acknowledged the importance of working together and relying on each other. And so when I was 16 and I first started getting involved in anarchism, I worked with Anti-Racist Action in North Carolina, and from there I lived in Baltimore briefly, and I got involved in an anarchist collective there that was kind of all over the map, did a lot of organizing in a lot of areas, and I traveled for a couple years, and I wasn't really involved in a lot while I was traveling and just taking time off. Although I did go to the WTO protests and kind of did some of the big protests. If I was in the area, I did attend those, but I didn't really do any organizing for a couple years. And then in Texas, I got involved in a lot of stuff that centered around prisons, and I worked with a Books to Prisoners program, which was not explicitly anarchist, but mostly run by anarchists. And I also was involved in an HIV activist group that also worked on prison issues and HIV, that also had a lot of anarchist ideas, but most people involved weren't anarchists. And then since then, throughout the years, was involved in a lot of like feminist conferences and organizing, and queer conferences and organizing and that kind of stuff that always had some anarchist ideas in it, but definitely wasn't explicitly anarchist. And then since I've been up here, I've largely worked with Coffee Strong. It's a GI anti-war coffee shop across from Fort Lewis that focuses on providing resources and GI rights counseling and all different kinds of stuff to the soldiers at Fort Lewis. And that has quite a few anarchists involved who are also veterans. And then I've been a member of the Worker Solidarity Alliance for about a little over 3 years, I think, and was involved in Common Action, which was a Northwest Regional Anarchist Association or organization for about 2 years. I think the reason that I chose anarchism versus other political philosophies has a bunch of different roots. Like one of which was it was the first more radical analysis of power that I ever was exposed to, And so that's part of why I stuck with it, honestly. Like, some of it was just like, it made sense to me out of the gate. And then over the years, I was exposed to different, different communist and socialist philosophies and other ideas. And, even if I did draw from some of them, I drew from them in the ways in which they were compatible with anarchism. And I think the reason why I really stuck with anarchism was because of its versatility and how it's adaptable, and it's in my mind about constantly interrogating your politics and making sure that they're still relevant, and that and you can kind of turn on a dime if you need to. If a new issue has come up, you can find ways of incorporating new analyses and ideas into it. It's not as strictly dogmatic as some of the other far left, like communist, socialist, radical groups. It's not as much party lines. It is about being versatile and being able to learn from mistakes and incorporate other ideas. And a good friend of mine calls her ideas around anarchism as theoretical polyamory, which I really appreciate. It's like an idea. Anarchism is a philosophy that allows you to draw from all different kinds of ideas because it doesn't have as strict of a dogma, I think. Anarchism, to me, as an anarchist communist, which is like the communist piece is an important part to me of how anarchism would work, is both about the rejection of oppression and hierarchy, but also about embracing like interdependence and relying on each other, and the importance of community and working together. And so I think a lot of times people sort of get the impression that anarchism is about the absence of like, state and capitalism and these different things, but I think it's important to also acknowledge what it is also about the presence of, which to me is a communist approach where the workers in the community work together to decide what should be produced, how it should be distributed, that kind of thing, and people having direct control over their lives and being empowered by it. And I think that empowerment aspect of an anarchist society is really important. It's not just the absence of the state and the absence of authority, I guess. It's also about the presence of like empowerment and justice and people like being able to work together, for the mutual benefit of everyone in your community and being like a whole person in many ways. One of the most common misconceptions that I've run into is the idea that anarchism is just a synonym for chaos and disorder. And I think that a lot of the reason why people think that is honestly based in the media. For the last over 100 years, the media has absolutely portrayed anarchists as, bomb-throwing people who have no interest in anything positive. They're just, angry at authority and don't want anyone interfering with their life. And I think that that's obviously a really incorrect characterization of anarchism. And I think there are also people who might take that interpretation and call themselves anarchists and really just be about rejecting authority in this blanket way that doesn't involve any of the positive aspects of anarchism. But they're absolutely in the minority, and that anarchism is actually about an extremely organized society. If there's going to be a world in which there aren't leaders and in which there isn't hierarchy and authority directing everyone, and everyone's working together for the mutual benefit of all, then you're going to have a very organized society, because it's going to be about practicing direct democracy in all of these different aspects of your life, which requires lots of organization, and more so than I think society has currently. And so the idea that anarchists want chaos and disorder couldn't be further from the truth. I think that historically, anarchism, as far as the theories that are made most available or people are most aware of, has had sometimes a weakness around addressing race, gender, sexuality, ability, like all these different other forms of oppression. And I think that the philosophy that I draw from a lot, that I think is incredibly compatible with anarchism, is intersectionality, which is a feminist philosophy that originated in the late 70s. Women of color basically were writing about how you can't separate out your identity and your experiences from each other. Like, you know, you're both black and a woman and a lesbian, and all those things inform each other. And so you, like, specifically what I'm thinking of is a response to the idea of separatism, where it was a popular idea in the American feminist movement in the 70s for lesbians to live lives as separate as possible from, like, men or heterosexuals or what have you. And there was a response to that call written by a collection of women of color who called the Combahee River Collective Statement, and in which they were talking about the importance of not dividing themselves from people that they need to work with. Like, they didn't want to be only a collection of black lesbians. They needed to be able to work across all of their different aspects of their identity and their experiences. And so the sort of response to that, the ideas that developed out of that, being intersectionality, is that all of these systems, capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, they're all interlocking. They're all interdependent. They rely on each other. They inform each other. And so you can't really, it's kind of a criticism of the idea of identity politics, that everything that a certain category experiences fits into a box. You know, so all women experience being a woman in the same way. That, frankly, is not true. And so intersectionality kind of talks about how the importance of recognizing how white supremacy and capitalism and all these other forms of oppression and exploitation affect where we stand as a woman. And so a lot of people like intersection, you stand at the intersection of all these different places of power, and so I think that is something that's very compatible with anarchism, having that sort of analysis that draws from the whole complete picture rather than just trying to make a single issue. And I also think that anarchists can bring a lot to the intersectionality theory by having a more stringent criticism of capitalism, because sometimes intersectionality gets stuck on the concept of classism, as if we just all treated if everyone just treated poor people well, then everything's fine. And so anarchists having a more stringent class analysis would really benefit intersectionality, and also intersectionality has been weak on a criticism of the state as something that props up these forms of oppression and exploitation. And so I think anarchists can bring a lot to intersectionality around the criticism of capitalism and the state, and that intersectionality is compatible with anarchism when in its best form, which is a complete rejection of all forms of hierarchy and oppression. I think it is important to note that there is another sort of idea around coercion, which is that as a community, you decide on certain principles, and people need to live up to those principles. For example, as a community, you have democratically decided that rape is not acceptable. Now, in my opinion, we won't have a successful society until we've gotten to a point in which rape and like other forms of interpersonal violence that rely on systems of power, like patriarchy, for example, until those systems of power are eradicated, we're not going to have a successful society. But there's still going to be individuals who act in antisocial ways, and we still do need ideas and principles by which all the community agrees to live by, which is democratically decided rather than imposed. But that is something to keep in mind as far as, like, you know, coercion on some level, maybe not with such a negative word, it will exist because as a society we want everyone to live up to a certain standards that benefit us all mutually, because it ensures the continuing of our communities and not having them be destroyed. I think the reason why anarchists focus generally on the working class is because that is the class which will, not to be too dramatic, will lead the revolution. And so while I acknowledge that class is not the only system of power that exists, and that capitalism is completely intertwined with white supremacy and patriarchy, I also am not interested in cross-class organizing quite as much. Like, I don't want to work with wealthy women on feminism. I want to work with working class women around feminism. I don't want to work with rich queers against homophobia. I want to work with working class queers on homophobia, because with using that working class lens, all the struggles have to be grounded in that in some way, in my opinion, because cross-class alliances can lead to problems where we see the focus shift towards, for example, feminism, the glass ceiling, the importance of women having access to power, and that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in empowering working class women with working class feminism against patriarchy, which also is intertwined with capitalism. And so I think that forms of feminism or anti-racism or different other approaches to power that embrace working closely with the ruling class, I find those not to be useful for the society that I'm working towards. Which is not to say that I approve of racist or sexist attacks on rich people. I don't think that racism or sexism is a tool to fight the class war, but it's important to me not to prioritize that kind of stuff, because I think what ends up happening is that we end up focusing, identity politics, plays a role in this. It's like, if we all work together because we all fit in box A together, it kind of erases the importance of class and recognizing that, and I think that that's a mistake. But I think, so while I don't think that we should use racism or sexism or homophobia as a weapon against the ruling class, I also don't have interest in working with the ruling class on issues around like feminism, because I think it's a dead end. I think it's just gonna recoup all of the power and the struggle that working class women have created back into capitalism, and just use it to reinforce the system and the status quo, frankly. I would definitely say that there's a lot of different ideas of what anarchism means, many of which are in direct conflict with each other. And while I think it is important to hash out some of the differences, because we need to know where we stand, it's good to be challenged on your ideas, and because it strengthens them. I also think that it's not necessary for all of us to be best friends and get along and be in the same organization together and all have the same agreement of what anarchism is. And so I like the idea of organizations that specifically define what they believe anarchism to be, and if you agree with it, you're in that organization, and if you don't, you're not. And if your organization is close enough to my organization, we can work together, and if not, we won't. And I think that's a better approach than trying to get everyone all together in the same tent. I think that oftentimes leads people to just spend all of their time infighting over the right, true, proper definition of something, and we end up just being stagnant and kind of just treading water and arguing with each other over the finer points of politics. I think it's a lot more productive for people to be in an organization that they feel it fits their definition of the politics that are important to them, and that can be narrow. And I don't think that's an inherently bad thing if you're working with other people when it makes sense. I think that I would describe myself as cautiously optimistic about the future. I think that I will probably not live to see an anarchist society, but I still think it's important for me to be laying the groundwork for it. for future generations to build off of, because while it's going to take a lot of work, we're going to have to see a lot of cultural shifts away from the institutions of oppression that really just have their fingers in our lives in ways that we don't even recognize, the ways that we're taught racism and sexism in such insidious ways that it takes a lot of work as a society to overcome it. And while I don't think that will happen in my life, I have faith that it's possible and that it could happen in the future. And I think laying the groundwork for organizing as a class is also really important, and that eventually we will reach a point of revolution, frankly, but I don't think I'll live to see it. I think some of the important work that needs to be done involves working with your coworkers and your neighbors. I think it's really easy for people to just sort of talk about politics and work and organize with the people that they're already close to socially. And so, people don't like stepping outside of their comfort zone. I think it is important to step outside of your comfort zone. If you were only organizing and working and talking with people who already pretty much agree with us, we're just going to stay right where we are. And so I think it's important for people to talk to their coworkers, even if it involves heated arguments. I think a lot of people really understand power in relation to their boss having power over their lives, and that's a common ground and a place to start from. And talking to our neighbors is important in our communities, in our neighborhoods, and that kind of thing. And I think if people are working to step outside of their comfort zone and organize against injustice in different forms across all the different boundaries that exist within the working class, I think that that's an important step towards building a better world.